The first time I heard the saw, I thought it was thunder. That was how Luke Banner marked the start of the strange part of his career. Not with the discovery of an old camp or a map glitch, but with that sound rolling out of the timber like a heartbeat in wood. He'd been in the field for 11 days, working out of a borrowed ranger station that still smelled of kerosene and wet wool. Mapping resource tracts for the Bureau wasn't glamorous work, but it kept him away from people. Every morning he rose before sunrise, loaded the drone, logged data, and let the forest tell him what it wanted to keep. The last parcel on his list was an oddity. Camp ADLER, historical. Coordinates typed in a format the GPS didn't recognize. He tried converting them twice before the display froze, blinked, and redrew the same spot 40 miles off any active road. The tag read, Active Cut Zone. He called it a clerical error. Still, something about the entry felt deliberate, the kind of mistake left there for someone curious enough to look. That afternoon, the wind carried a smell Luke hadn't noticed in years. Resin and hot oil, the scent of a saw blade biting through green pine. The sound came a few seconds later, deep and rhythmic, echoing through the drainage like a pulse. No chainsaws, not that jagged scream, but a continuous hum, old world and mechanical. He launched the drone, let it climb until the forest was a carpet of shifting green. The feed flickered, then stabilized on a valley pocketed in fog. Through the static he glimpsed something impossible. Freshly felled trunks, cut ends glistening. For a moment, smoke drifted between the trees. Then the screen went black. He replayed the clip. The smoke was gone. The trees stood whole again. By nightfall, he'd convinced himself it was interference. Humidity, bad reception, anything logical. He packed up, started drafting the report. Before sending it, he texted his supervisor, Tom Delaney, a man who measured belief in billable hours. Luke, ADLER coordinates pulled live data. You sure this site's inactive? Tom, Camp ADLER burned down 35. Do not enter restricted zones. Copy? Luke stared at the reply. He could almost hear Delaney's tone, the lazy authority of someone who'd never left a paved lot. But the recording still looped on his laptop, a few seconds of forest haze and that pulsing hum under the wind. He turned up the volume until the cheap speakers crackled. Beneath the drone noise, something else emerged, a faint whistle, like a man signaling shift change. He muted it quickly, heart pounding, embarrassed by how real it felt. He told himself he'd close the laptop, sleep, and leave it alone in the morning. Instead, just before dawn, he found himself lacing his boots, loading the pack, and scribbling a single line in his field log. ADLER, verify coordinates, personal check. Outside, the forest was silver with mist. The wind had died, but from somewhere far below the ridge came that sound again. Slow, deliberate, and steady. The saw was still running. The road to Camp ADLER wasn't on any map Luke had, digital or paper. He followed the old surveyor's trick, tracing drainages, looking for the line that the land wanted him to take. It led him through stands of red spruce and balsam fir so dense he had to turn sideways to pass. The morning mist clung low, coiling around his legs like breath. By noon, his GPS had gone useless, blinking between coordinates like a coin flipping. The device spat out a final reading, signal lost, and died. Luke switched to compass and instinct, convinced the terrain itself was trying to nudge him in circles. He kept moving. The forest had a texture that didn't feel right. Trees grew in unnaturally even rows, spaced like soldiers. The bark gleamed with fresh pitch, though some trunks were hollow inside, their hearts cut out. A faint layer of sawdust coated everything, too fine to be recent, as if it had snowed wood. He stopped once to drink from a creek and caught a reflection in the water, faint light, moving between the trees. He looked up. Nothing. When he glanced back down, the reflection lingered for half a heartbeat longer than it should have, pulsing like a lantern behind fog. He pressed on, following what looked like the remains of an old rail tram, the kind used in early logging camps to haul timber downhill. The tracks were buried in moss, but deep, wide impressions lined the path. Boot prints. Not boots like his, but squared, heavy-toed workman's types. Recent. He crouched to photograph them. The moment he did, the forest fell completely silent. No insects, no birds. Only the wind moving high above the canopy. He turned his field recorder on and clipped it to his vest. "ADLER vicinity," he muttered. "Found what looks like tramway access. Impressions indicate possible illegal logging. Continuing north." By late afternoon, the light had gone amber. He found a clearing and decided to camp. As he boiled water, the forest began to hum again, faint, rhythmic, distant. He froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. It was the same tone from the drone audio, a steady mechanical beat. Luke stood and turned slowly. Through the trees, several hundred yards away, the faint glow pulsed. Too regular for fire, too soft for headlights. He listened hard, picking out fragments through the hum. Hammering. A shouted word. "Timber!" Echoing like it had been caught in a canyon. He checked the recorder's input levels. The spikes were there. Someone or something was making that noise. He grabbed his flashlight and started toward the glow, careful, deliberate. The forest brightened with every step, the mist turning orange. Then, without warning, the light blinked out. The sound stopped mid-beat. When his eyes adjusted, he realized he was standing in the middle of another clearing, empty, silent, and utterly still. His own boot tracks were the only disturbance in the layer of sawdust covering the ground. He turned back toward camp. The woods felt smaller now, angles wrong. When he finally broke through to where he'd left his tent, his breath caught. The tent had been moved. Not collapsed or torn, relocated. It sat 10 feet downhill, perfectly pitched. His backpack was stacked neatly beside the stream, zippers closed. On top of it rested a small metal lunch pail, dented but clean. Luke knelt and opened it. Inside lay half a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, browned with age but whole. The bread was stamped with a manufacturer's mark. Merrill's Bakery, Portland, 1935. He looked up sharply. The forest around him shifted, just enough for the shadows to trade places. Somewhere far off, that saw started again. Closer this time, like it had been waiting for him to sit down. Luke broke camp at first light, too wired to eat, too cold to think straight. The fog had thickened overnight into a kind of gauze that swallowed every sound. He kept the recorder running as he hiked, voice low and measured to keep his pulse steady. Moving north. Following what looks like grade. Sound of equipment continuing. Possible logging operation. Unregistered. He wanted the words on tape in case anything happened. People went missing in these forests sometimes. Sinkholes, old shafts, bears. Logical things. But as the morning brightened, logic felt less and less like a companion. The path widened ahead, framed by 2 leaning pines cut at perfect 90-degree angles. Beyond them, Camp ADLER. It wasn't ruins. It was alive. Cabins lined both sides of the clearing, 20 or more, their roofs patched with tin, chimneys smoking thin blue streams. The generator coughed somewhere unseen, and through the haze came the unmistakable ring of metal teeth on wood. For a long moment, Luke just stood there. The place breathed, not metaphorically, but audibly. Boards creaked in rhythm, ropes strained, pulleys whined. Then, movement. Men emerged from between the shacks carrying saws, hammers, coils of rope. They moved with slow, purposeful rhythm, never speaking. Their clothes were wrong. Suspenders, wool, thick leather boots, faces streaked with soot and sap. The nearest one passed close enough that Luke smelled the creosote on him. "Hey!" Luke called. "You're not supposed to be here!" "This lands." The man didn't even glance his way, just kept walking, head bowed, steps soundless despite the gravel. Luke turned to another worker. "You hear me?" Nothing. It was like being underwater, voices and motion muted, each sound delayed by a heartbeat. He forced himself forward, past a mess hall and into a narrow lane between bunkhouses. Tools hung neatly from pegs, axes, handsaws, wedges, all gleamed like they'd been sharpened that morning. Inside one cabin, sunlight broke through a boarded window and lit a long table covered in ledgers. Luke opened one. The ink was still dark. 1934, 1935, 1936. Each entry signed by Foreman R. Adler. The handwriting was tidy, exact. He flipped to the last page and froze. May 12th, 2025. Cut quota met. Awaiting the truck. He checked again. Same date as today. Same signature. Something thudded outside, the slow fall of a tree. Dust sifted from the rafters. Luke moved to the window, and in that single glance his entire sense of time collapsed. The camp was different. The colors drained to sepia, the smoke thicker and black. The men worked faster, shouting over the roar of flames licking the treetops. Firelight flickered on their faces, some calm, some screaming. He blinked. The scene snapped back. The fire was gone. The men silent again. Only the faint hum of the saws remained. Luke turned, heart hammering, and his eyes fell on a photograph nailed to the far wall. A group shot, a dozen men in front of a log pile. The man in the center, tall and square-jawed, wore a foreman's cap, the same face Luke had seen outside. Eyes dull, mouth set in that strange half-smile of a person frozen mid-sentence. Luke backed away. The room darkened as if the sun had been turned off. The smell of smoke returned, thicker now. A low moan rolled through the cabin, wood expanding in the heat. When he turned back toward the door, the walls were blackened and charred, half collapsed. The ledgers lay scattered, pages burnt around the edges. Through the broken roof, snow fell, though the sky outside had been clear a moment before. He stumbled into the yard. The camp was empty again, the smoke gone. Only the rhythmic creak of distant timber filled the air. He pressed the recorder to his mouth. Adler camp confirmed. Site appears functional. There are people, but the tape hissed. No playback light blinked. Then faintly through the static, a whistle blowing 3 times. Shift change. He didn't run so much as leak out of the camp, slipping between bunkhouses and stacks of cordwood, trying not to turn his back on anything that made noise. The noise was everywhere. Saws droned in the marrow of the trees, ropes breathed. The generator coughed like an animal having trouble dying. Luke found the tram grade again and followed it downhill, grateful for gravity and the promise of the truck. He kept the recorder against his chest, thumb white on the red button. Exiting site. Unknown personnel present. Possible reenactment crew. No. Scratch that. The grade thinned into a corridor of standing fir. He expected the old culvert, the S-bend, the clearing with the boulder shaped like a sleeping dog. None of it was there. The land had been ironed. The forest stood in files and ranks, every trunk a measured distance from the next. The wind didn't push through. It counted. His radio, dead since noon yesterday, crackled awake. A hiss, a man's breath. Then, level as a ledger line. Trucks late. Keep cutting. Who is this? Luke whispered, throat dry. Identify. Static replied. Then another voice, like the same one spoken through teeth. Keep cutting. He killed the radio and pushed on. The ground underfoot changed from duff to packed dust to a fine grit that scuffed like ash. When he reached what should have been the road, he found an aisle of stumps in perfect rows, each slab clean and flat, sap glistening like varnish. There was a road, just not the kind that took tires. He turned left, then left again, and came out in the same aisle. He marked a trunk with his knife, walked until his heart kicked, and arrived back at the same mark. Only now it was twice on the bark, then thrice, then, absurdly, unmarked again. Shapes moved between the ranks, not men. Absences. The places where men would be. They carried weight that hadn't been lifted yet. Shoulders hunched under invisible logs, hands curled around tools Luke couldn't see but could hear. The rasp of teeth, the nick of wedges, the grunt of effort. He tried to step aside and felt air brush his arm like cloth that wasn't there. He found the tool shed by accident, stepping through a door that hadn't been visible until he needed it. Inside, the smell of oil and cold iron. Hooks held nothing, yet the hooks sagged. A narrow window admitted gray light over a bench and a floor worn by boots. On the floorboards, a map, carved not with knife but with insistence. Lines meeting lines, a grid of the forest with small symbols where cabins and rails should be. Each square had a date burned into the wood. Old Year's dark and soft. New Year's hard, bright. He traced his finger to the corner marked with his current coordinates. The letters were the cleanest, as if cut that morning. Active. Inspector. Sent. His name wasn't there. He looked for it anyway. Something thumped the wall outside, a log hitting a bunkhouse, an elbow knocking in an impossible hallway. He heard voices past the door, low, professional, not unkind. Quotas due. Loaded. Trucks late. Keep cutting. He crouched lower, suddenly certain standing was a way to be seen. The recorder in his palm ticked as if counting seconds it didn't own. He thought of the ledger dates, the neat columns, the line about awaiting the truck. He had come to verify a coordinate. He had brought a drone, a camera, a body that could sign for deliveries. "You ain't on the list," a voice said right by his ear. Luke lurched back, knocking the bench. Tools that weren't there clanged to the floor. He stared up at the doorway and saw a man the color of photographs. Square shoulders, foreman's cap, sap in the seams of his hands. The eyes were wrong, more like sockets that had taught themselves to look. "List?" Luke managed. "Posted at the mess," the foreman said. He didn't open his mouth so much as allow words to escape. Men logged in. Men logged off. That's how it keeps. You ain't on it. "I don't want to be," Luke said, and heard how false it sounded. He was on things. Payroll, permits, routes. The world to this point had known him by lists. The foreman stepped aside and the aisle of stumps beyond animated into a worksite. That was the only word. The men who weren't men moved with the rhythm that earlier had only been sound. They shouldered nothing and stacked it into nowhere. Wedges split emptiness that behaved like wood. A rope tightened around the absence of a log and burned a groove into a beam that didn't support it. Luke's head swam. This was industry without matter. Labor detached from product. Motion for quota. He bolted. The shed door slammed behind him and ricocheted into silence. For a heartbeat, the forest was just a forest, the kind that froze midwinter and thawed in juddering spring. Then a whistle blew, 3 notes, the same from his recordings, scissoring the air clean. Everything moved, not just men, the trees. They leaned in unison, not with wind but with intent, their crowns bowing, trunks listing, roots creaking like old ships. The aisles shifted as if rails slid beneath the earth. Stumps rotated. Pathways closed and opened like mouths. Luke started for the gap that looked like escape and watched it narrow into a slot too thin for breath. He cut sideways, hands in front, whispering numbers as if coordinates could bribe the geometry. 45.1 minus 68.2. The numbers came back out of the bark in somebody else's handwriting. He found the culvert then, not where it belonged, but he found it, and crawled through a throat of wet stone. On the far side, dim and blessed, a sliver of road, gravel, a candy wrapper, the print of his own truck tires. He staggered toward it, laughing once, a dry bark that scared him. The radio hissed again. "Truck's here," the voice said. "Stand by." Headlights swung across the trees, pale and low, turning sawdust into snow. A vehicle eased up the grade with the patience of something that knew the route and wasn't worried by time. The cab was an older model, but too clean. Door painted with a name he recognized without wanting to. ADLER. It stopped beside him. The passenger door opened with a soft, well-oiled sigh. Luke peered in. The seat was empty. The clipboard on the dash wasn't. A sheet of paper, crisp as new bark, with a column of names and 2 boxes beside each, in and out, ticked in neat, tidy X's. The bottom line was blank, the printed name waiting like an open mouth. Banner, Luke. He looked up. The foreman stood in the beams, cap in hand, patient as workers' comp. The whistle blew again, far off, drawing breath for the next note. "Quota's met," the foreman said. "We can load if you'll log." Luke's pen was already in his fingers. He didn't remember taking it out. He held it over the paper, a moth hovering over heat. The forest clicked into alignment, 1,000 unseen teeth finding purchase. From the recorder, his voice unspooled, delayed from some earlier moment. Exiting site, no. Scratch that. Continuing. He looked at the road beyond the truck. It ran straight as a truth you tell yourself, then bent slightly, then bent again until it was indistinguishable from the aisles between the stumps. The pen touched down. The pen made a faint scratching sound. Then the page darkened under the ink, the letters sinking rather than written. The air shifted. The forest exhaled. Luke looked up, pen still in his hand. The truck's engine rumbled to life. Its headlights flared brighter, cutting long tunnels through the fog, tunnels filled with dust motes that didn't move like dust. They pulsed, expanding and contracting, each rhythm syncing to the slow drag of the saws starting again somewhere deeper in the valley. The foreman nodded once, satisfied. "Load's ready." The sound that followed wasn't mechanical. It was human effort, 100 men heaving as one. The earth trembled under the weight of something Luke couldn't see. The bed of the truck sank half an inch, though nothing physical touched it. Luke stumbled back. "I'm not part of this," he said aloud to no one. "I'm done." But the forest didn't listen. The forest had him. When he turned, the road behind was gone, or rather multiplied. Dozens of tracks split off at impossible angles, each one identical. His truck, the government-issued Ford, sat at the head of every one, each version older or newer, rusted or clean, headlights on or off. Every door open, every cab empty. His radio came alive again. The voice this time wasn't just in the static, it was behind him, layered in the air. "Keep cutting." "Quotas due. Truck's waiting." Luke bolted toward his own truck, the newest one, he thought. But when he yanked the handle, the door didn't move. Inside, the cab was full of snow, not weather snow, sawdust packed tight, filling the seats, the dash, the steering column. It spilled out when he forced the latch, covering his boots like ash. The foreman's voice came from the tree line. "You signed." "Can't unsign." Luke spun. The man was closer now, expression calm, eyes like wet paper. "You sent for me?" Luke said. This isn't my quota." The foreman tilted his head. "You're the inspector. You certify production. You always were." Luke tried to back away, but the ground tilted beneath him. The gravel was pulsing, breathing with the same rhythm as the saws. From every stump rose thin lines of steam. Not heat, but breath. The forest inhaled and exhaled through cut wood. He dropped to his knees and clawed at the recorder, pressing play. Static roared, then his own voice from earlier whispered, "ADLER camp confirmed. Site appears functional." Then another voice, his own again, but slower, tired. "Cut quota met. Awaiting the truck." The truck's horn blared once, low and mournful, echoing down the endless corridors of trees. Luke ran. He didn't know which way, just away from the hum, away from the foreman's silhouette. Branches lashed at him, pine needles tore his sleeves. The world folded in on itself, bunkhouses, tracks, cabins flickering in and out like memory bleeding through old film. He fell once, hard, palms sinking into sawdust that felt almost warm. When he looked up, he was standing at the camp gate again. A new sign hung crookedly from a beam of fresh timber. Camp banner. Active. He screamed until his throat tore. The forest answered by going still. Days later, a search team found Luke's truck idling near the collapsed bridge 12 miles from where he'd last checked in. The engine had been running for at least 2 days. The passenger seat was empty except for a clipboard. The last page bore his signature, the date, and 2 words scrawled in trembling pencil. Quota met. Inside the cab, the field recorder still rolled, battery long dead but tape spinning in short mechanical jerks. When investigators played it back, they heard wind, distant machinery, and then, under it all, the faint creak of trees bending in rhythm. At the 20-minute mark, a voice surfaced. Not Luke's, deeper, confident. "ADLER camp reporting. Inspector verified. Begin next cycle." The recording ends with a single sharp note, the 3-tone whistle of shift change. The case was filed as exposure and delusion, the area sealed again under federal jurisdiction. But months later, hikers cutting across the valley reported hearing something faint at dusk. A saw running somewhere in the timber, steady and patient. And sometimes, if the wind's right, a truck horn echoes once through the hills before the forest goes quiet again. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods and hear that steady hum, don't follow it. Some machines don't stop just because the people did. If you enjoyed tonight's story, help keep the campfire burning. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next tale from the dark side of the map. Every action keeps this channel alive. and the stories coming.